Hello, welcome to my recap of the game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Rapport from Semifinal of Grand Prix in Belgrade, and this was the game 2. You can check out game 1 on my channel. Rapport won that game in the Greenfield and it was really a smooth game. And MVL needed to win the second game to secure tie breaks. And let's see what happened. We had the Spanish opening, and it was expected from Rapport to play something very solid, but he chose to do something else. And he chose this Steinitz variation, delayed Steinitz, I think. And after castling, it was expected to go bishop d7, g6, bishop g7, some solid stuff. But he chose a different path, and he chose bishop g4, which leads to a very sharp position after h3 to go h5. A very often seen idea in Spanish, to sacrifice the bishop, but to open up the h file and to generate some dangerous attack on the king. And now MVL plays d4, because if you take here on g4, then black recaptures and goes queen h4 once the knight moves from f3. So d4 actually leads to some sharp position, after which black gives up the bishop for 2 pawns. And black plays here b5, bishop b3 back, and now knight d4. Black captures the pawn on d4 and uses the pin on the queen. Here, if bishop takes f3, that's not gonna work out pretty well, because after queen takes, let's say queen f6, there is queen c3. And now there is lots of pressure on the knight on c6 and pawn on c7. If you take on d4, then there is queen c7. If knight e7, then white captures, d takes, and now you can go a4, b4, and after queen c4, white remains some pressure due to bishop pair, and black is simply less developed than white. So here Rapport chose to take on d4, and he actually sacrifices the piece after this move. And now MVL takes hg, but now it's the point that knight g5 is possible. Now knight is blocking the queen from getting to h4, and now the attack on h file is not so dangerous, and now the f7 pawn becomes a target. So that's why knight h6 is played. But now the issue with white's position is that knight on g5 cannot advance. It cannot go back to f3 or h3. It cannot take on f7 and go to any other square. So it's more or less trapped in this situation. And white has to play somewhat energetically to keep this knight on g5, or somehow to get it back to f3, or somehow to break through. And here MVL plays g3. A move which makes some luft for the king, makes some space. And with king g2, rook h1, the h file would be under control. Also, what's interesting here is a move like bishop d5. The point of this move is to trap this knight on d4 and to force the exchange of bishop for knight in that way. So if c6, then c3 would happen, and after taking on d5, which has to happen because the knight cannot move back to e6 due to multiple captures or just bishop c6, so cd5, cd4, and after bishop e7, white has this move, and he can defend the knight on g5 pretty easily. And it seems like black doesn't have enough compensation for the missing piece. And also after bishop d5, bishop e7 is very interesting, but doesn't look very human. Now you cannot capture the rook because bishop g5 is happening, and there's no blockade anymore on the h-file, and black can generate some dangerous pressure on the h-file. Even though he's a rook down, but simply white is in so much danger because the king side is not defended so well. So after bishop e7, c3 is the best. And after c6, now you can capture on f7 first, and after this, all these captures, cd4, and now rook h5 is very interesting because you want to go queen h8 next. Queen h8 and give a checkmate on h1. So now white has to make space for his king by playing f4, and after queen h8 to go king f2 and somehow to evacuate the king. And I find this position better for white, but there are some practical chances for black, of course, because the king is still not in the safe zone, and there is still some potential danger. But let's go back to the game. Let's go back to the move g3, which was played. And now Rapport plays bishop e7. Bishop e7 trying to kick this knight away, and now MVL plays f4, trying to support this knight on g5. And now black is keeping this tension in the center. He doesn't want to capture on f3 because that just brings the knight back to f3, so he goes queen d7. Queen d7 now, and now f5 by MVL. Probably it was better just to keep this tension, not to move the pawn, to play something like queen d3. But I don't know, maybe he was afraid of f6, even though that leads to c3, and or some other move, maybe fe5. So let's say f6. What do you do then? You take on e5 or else? Well, you can do this, knight e6 and queen d5, actually. And then you double attack on a8 and e6 at the same time. So he chose this one, and this makes the knight on g5 more unstable. And now Rapport tries to close all the holes in the center by playing c6, and now knight c3. Nope, not this one. Knight c3. Now black can also castle on the queen side as well, but first he has to secure the f7 pawn. But now first he can go queen d8, which he did in the game. Also a5 looks very interesting here. a5, and now the idea is after a4 to go b4, and after going back to just take, and go d5. And still, white's issue is this knight on g5, which is quite stranded. And it doesn't have a good square to go. And the h file is still there, potentially as a dangerous asset for black. But in the game, Rapport chose queen d8, attacks the knight, and now MVL chose to get the piece back, knight f7, and queen g4. You don't capture on f7 because it makes c2 undefended, and after this, queen takes g4, knight c2. After a check, just go back to g8, and it's supposed to be much better for black. So white chose to keep the bishop on b3 to defend the pawn. He took like this, and now black took on b3, ab, and bishop g5. A very useful move, trying to exchange his not so good bishop for potentially good bishop on c1. And now king g2 by white, trying to compete for the h file, and now queen f6, releasing some space for the potential queenside castle. Now knight d1, and because the knight has to improve somehow, and on c3 it's very limited by the pawn on c6, the pawn on b5, and it has to go to some other squares. Well, this is a mistake. Black goes for this, rook c1, and now queen g5. Trying to exchange even more. Now knight f2. And Rapport chose to exchange on g4. For example, if you go queen h6 here, just it runs into rook h1, and it's not very good for black. After this, c4, the queenside gets opened up, and the king also doesn't have a safe square to go. So black chose to just take on g4, knight g4, and knight g5. Now the e4 pawn becomes a small target for black. Knight goes back to f2, and now black castled here, which wasn't so good. The better option was to go king e7 and then keep d6 defended, also a6 under some protection, and maybe even expand with a4, with a5, a4 on the next couple of moves. Because if you imagine the exchange like this, a5, a4, if white takes, black takes on a4, and suddenly the b2 pawn becomes a target. So let's just say rook fd1, a5, rook d3, a4, and now even if you take like this, you can consider rook takes a4 and putting pressure on the e4. But let's say if you go rook cd1, you can take first on b3, cb3, and just go back to f7. And black should be fine here. It's not so easy to push the g-pawn at this moment, and also white has to be careful about doubling on the h-file and some potential counterplay on that side. So king e7 was better, but he went for this, and now black was deprived of any counterplay on the queen side. And now MVL starts some action on that side. c4, and now king c7. After which rook h1 was played. And now he could have played king b6 and keep things very solid. If you need knight f7, you can go back to protect the d6 pawn and somehow keep this position together. But Rapport chose to take on c4, and after bc, now the a6 pawn becomes much more available because there's also some potential rook lift. Let's say rook a1 and rook hc1, rook c3, and if the king defends by king b6, to kick this king away and to put even more pressure on a6. Now Rapport plays a5, after which rook a1 goes, and now king b6 was played. Although here it's better to exchange rooks, and after this to go king d7, to go to the other side. And what's the point of this king maneuver? Well, we'll see it very soon. If white attacks the pawn by rook a1, rook a8, and if g4, king e7, let's say the king wants to go to e3 to defend the pawn on e4, because you want to free the knight, but you cannot do that with the knight on f2 and only defending the e4 pawn. So let's say if you go king f1, then knight goes to f3 and gets to d4. And I think black has enough counter chances in that case. He might even give up the a pawn for the b pawn. In case some rook b8 happens, just exchange those two pawns and have enough counterplay. Let's say after rook a4 to threaten b4, black goes c5, and after king e2, give a check and get to f6 with the king, rook b8 next, and I think black has plenty of chances. Or even if you're afraid to give up the pawn, you can go knight c6 and then go to b8 and put pressure on b2. But in the game, what happened was that black played king b6 and now rook hd1, trying to get some rook lift, rook d3 and rook b3. And again, there was a chance for black to get some counter chances with a move like g6 to open up the king side, and in case of rook d3 to capture and go e4. And now I think if you go give a check, king c5 is quite strong. And unless you get checkmated immediately, I think white is very good here. Let's say if rook a5, you take on c4. And I don't see something immediate. Like, if you go here, I can go to b4, and even though these rooks look pretty scary, I don't see immediate win for white. If you try this, I might even go rook b8 just to be secure of some checkmates. And after, let's say, rook da3, then just play this, and after capture and take, go knight f3, and with those two pawns, I think black has good chances to survive. But Rapport chose a different move, rook h7, trying to double his rooks on the h file, but the knight on f2 does a good job of defending against any entries. Rook h2 doesn't seem particularly dangerous on its own, so I don't really buy the whole thing. And MVL just plays rook d3. He also doesn't buy the bluff. Rook dh8, and now rook takes rook b3. And now there was a small trick here. If white takes on d6, there is this check, and after king g1, just take on f2 and use this fork. After this, knight e4, and win the rook on d6. So white chose this, king a6, and now the a5 pawn is going to fall very soon. Rapport has to do something, and he chose rook h2, king f1, and now king b6, which was met by capturing on a5, knight f3, and now a very nice move by MVL, and he plays c5 in this moment. The point of this move is to occupy the c5 square by black's pawn. So in case of rook a6 here, black cannot run away with king c5, and after this king d4, and somehow black's king is safely put between these pawns. And after this you have a check, and after this you can even take on f2, and this position becomes quite interesting because there is for sure some compensation for the exchange after rook b8, rook a2. The e-pawn might become quite a factor later on, and after rook h8 you can go here, but there is this knight f3, and rook h2 comes next, which can become quite annoying. After this, you can take on c4 later, and still there is this e-pawn, which is quite a good asset. Unless I'm somehow missing... well, I might be missing something really stupid, like rook a4 here. Well, rook a4... oh, rook a4, there is king e3, and black might be the one who comes on top. So white can play something like f6 to liquidate as many pieces as possible, as many pawns as possible, and after this, still black has some good chances to survive this. Although I don't think black has any dangerous motives here than just to make some counterplay and keep these two pawns under control. And yeah, that's why MVL played c5 here, trying to deprive the king from c5. Black took on c5, and now rook a6. King goes to b5, because c7, let's just mention even that. If black goes to c7, there is this check, and you cannot go back, because after this check, now there is rook a3. And now there is a threat like rook b7, king c4. Let's say if I play some empty move like rook h7, there is this threat. And after this, check, king d4, and checkmate on d7. Also, of course, the threat of knight capture on f3. So, but just to mention, in case of some random move happens. So after this and king b6 back, white can just capture on g7, and after knight d4, let's say, rook e7, the e5 pawn becomes quite loose, and the king is also quite unsafe as well. So black doesn't want that, and he goes to b5 here. MVL gives a check, and because it's move 40, around the move 40, white chose to repeat some checks, and he went for rook a4, king b5, and again this check, king b6, and now rook a6. King b5, and again this check, king b4, and now it's move 40, and white can think about some winning chances, because now he has half an hour more. He goes back to a3. Now the same threat goes rook a3 and rook c3 next. So now black gives a check, king g1 and knight c4. The knight has to somehow find a way to defend, and white plays rook d3. After which the c6 pawn is under attack, so rook goes to h6. Here, if you take on b2, there is a check, and after king c4 you don't capture because there is this capture and the rook hangs on d3. So here white can just go rook a3, and the knight is simply trapped, and black has to capture on f2 actually. After this, knight d1, king g2, knight c3. Oh no, terrible mistake. Knight c3, and still the game is not completely winning for white, but he retains some chances because after rook a7 he will eventually capture either c6 or g7 or both, but there is a c pawn, a c passed pawn, which might keep some chances to black. But he chose a different path and he chose rook h6, after which MVL chose rook a7 and now rook b8, just supporting the king, not allowing any checks on b7. And now b3 by MVL, which leaves this b pawn more vulnerable than it is. And actually the biggest issue with this move is that it loses some time and it improves the knight. So actually here knight g4 was very good, and after going back to h8 white captures, you take on b2 and now rook d6. Still, because of this c pawn, which can be quite dangerous, it's not entirely clear if it's winning or not, but for sure white has some good chances to win, because he's gonna capture even on e5, on c6, and black's only hope is this c pawn, and it's basically a race between the three pawns on the king side versus the only pawn on the queen side. And MVL chose to play this. Knight goes to a5 and now knight g4. Rapport of course takes on b3 and he offers the exchange on h6. But MVL doesn't take on h6. He chose to capture on g7 first. But actually this was the better choice. Knight takes h6 and after c4 to go rook d6. And then take rook c6, and as in the previous lines, the only hope is the c pawn, so black somehow has to push it further, and black can do knight d4, but I think that white is almost winning after rook h6, and after c3 you can go here, and after c2 now the g pawn can run, and it's not so easy now. You can give up the rook and still run with these pawns. After this the g pawn runs, and these two pawns are quite fast. Also to mention around here, if black tries to stop rook c7 and play this, there is this move, and the next move is going to be rook c7, trying to keep this c pawn under control. But in the game, Vachier-Lagrave played rook g7, after which Rapport plays c4, ignores the threat of capturing the rook and creates his own In case of knight h6, then you take on d3, and now black even has 2 passers on the queen side. And it might be black who is winning now. So white has to go back. Now rook h8, and white grabs the pawn on e5, but after rook c8, black appears to be doing very well in the moment. Because now the c-pawn is quite advanced, and in 2 moves it might get very close. Now MVL plays rook g6, but now c5 just... black just gives up the exchange, after which white has 2 rooks, but also black has 2 passers on the c-file. Although doubled, but it doesn't mind. Black pushes, and now f6, but also white has some hope as well. He has those 3 pawns on the other side. c2 by black, and now rook f1. Now finally black promotes, but now black has to take care of these pawns on the other side. And now he pushes e5. And the threat is rook b6 to somehow avoid, to somehow deflect the rook from the 8th rank, and then to push blah 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 blah, and then to push the pawns in the center. Now black gave a check and went for this. And now rook d6, rook b6 is not possible because now the pawns are stopped after knight e6, and that's the point of the whole maneuver. Knight e2, knight d4 to get to e6 and to control the f8. So after this, rook d6 was played, but knight b5, and after this, now the c-pawn becomes the second hope for black. Now white pushes and black pushes as well. c3, e7, and now c2 by black. Now white cannot stop the pawn, so he chose to push his own. c1 queen, e8 queen, because if f8 queen, then we have queen c5 and rook f8 next. So that's not gonna work out. White has to promote this pawn. But now black has a very simple perpetual after queen c5, king g2, give a check here, and after this to go to h6. And now white has to go back to g2, because if he goes to g4, there is check on g6 and any king move, rook e8, and black is winning. So after king g2, in this position, they agreed to a draw, because there is no way that white's gonna avoid perpetual in this position. After queen c6, you can go here, but you just have queen c2, and you cannot go here because of queen f5 and losing the rook on d7. So actually white doesn't have any good shot for stopping this pawn, this perpetual check. And that's how Rapport qualified for the finals, and eventually he won the whole thing, the Grand Prix in Belgrade. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching this, and any questions, let me know in the comment section. See you soon, and bye bye.